So it's my great pleasure to introduce Rebecca Earle. So Rebecca is a professor of history at the University of Warwick, and her work initially focused on Spanish colonial America, and her books included Spain and the Independence of Colombia, The Return of the Native, and The Body of the Conquistador. More recently, she's focused on the history of food, and in particular the potato, about which she's written 2 books and several articles. Now, I do enjoy your daily potato quotes, and do check those out. So tonight, talking about a new project, so the world of Jacob de Pinna, Notary and Culture-Broker. Back to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for giving me a chance to talk about Jacob de Pinna. So let me get my clicker. So Jacob de Pinna, and you can see him listed there. There we are on this commercial entry. Was a Sephardic Jew born in Amsterdam who worked as a notary in London in the 18th century. Notaries drew up commercial and personal documents, from wills to customs declarations, and they produced certified translations of them. And they were essential to the smooth functioning of many enterprises in 18th century Britain, including the naval warfare that occupied the British state and its people almost continuously during Jacob de Pinna's working life. And de Pinna was one of the British High Court of Admiralty's favorite translator notaries, who was employed for over 50 years to translate bills of lading, ships' inventories, and the other papers found on ships captured by the Royal Navy. The Admiralty utilized him also as an interpreter for the crews of captured foreign ships. I became interested in Jacob de Pinna through his involvement in a long-running legal dispute involving a pair of captured ships. In 1793, 2 ships, the Spanish Santiago Apostol and the French Général Dumouriez, were both captured by the Royal Navy and brought into Portsmouth. The capture caused an international dispute between Britain and Spain, and ultimately contributed to Spain declaring war on Britain in 1796. This was a quite consequential capture, but I won't, tempting though it is, I will not burden you now with the larger story of the capture of this ship, merely to say that while the course dragged on through the British legal system, which a process that lasted 2 years, Jacob de Pinna was employed as a translator and an interpreter for the 100 or so Spanish-speaking crew on the Santiago Apostol, the Spanish vessel that was captured. And what attracted my attention to him, aside from his unusual name, which stood out in the documentation, was the social role that I thought translator-interpreters such as Jacob de Pinna must have played in the lives of these mariners during the more than 2 years that they spent on the Isle of Wight, waiting for this case to slowly grind through the British legal system. In fact, not just the crew, but also the hapless passengers on the ship, which included an 8-year-old boy, among other people. So they, it seemed to me, must have regarded Jacob de Pinna as a bit of a lifeline. He must have been one of the few people involved in the legal case with whom they could converse. So I was curious about the role that he played in their efforts, not just to understand the legal case against them, but also perhaps life in Britain in general. And I was particularly curious about what role he might have played, because the scholarship on contemporary court interpreters stresses that translators and live interpreters in particular perform complex emotional and intercultural work, even if that's not the purpose for which they're employed, that's part of what's involved in being an interpreter. And so I became curious whether there was any sort of evidence that Jacob de Pinna was a kind of culture broker operating between Britain and these Spanish mariners. So in this presentation, I want to try to answer 2 broad questions about Admiralty translators such as Jacob de Pinna. I want to consider, first of all, whether there's any evidence that these men did act as intercultural go-betweens, to use a kind of shorthand. And I'm also curious about whether we can reconstruct Jacob de Pinna's working life, or even his mental universe, using the invoices and ships inventories and other documents, which are all, as far as I am aware, remain of from his working life. So I want to try to answer both of those questions. But before that, I want to say a little bit more about Admiralty translators in general. So let's see, maybe I have a slide that says Admiralty translators. There we are. So as I said a moment ago, translators were an essential part of British naval bureaucracy in the 18th century. And we might imagine possibly that the 18th century Royal Navy was focused entirely on battling enemy fleets, but a great deal of their activity was instead focusing on capturing commercial ships, the so-called taking of prize. This, as it was called at the time, this annoying the enemy by capturing their ships, aimed at disrupting the economy. It was a form of economic warfare. It also enriched the UK. Millions of pounds of prize goods flowed into the British economy as a result of the capture of enemy ships during this period. And all this process was regarded by European nations as totally legitimate, provided that captures were focused uniquely on enemy vessels and enemy cargoes. The status of goods on neutral ships was much more complicated, and I won't get into that, but it was, it generated lawsuits and a lot of bad feeling if neutral goods or neutral ships were captured. But for this reason, determining the so-called national character of a ship was fundamental to the entire process of naval prize. You needed to work out if it was a French ship or maybe just a harmless Danish ship. Determining this relied largely on interrogation of the crew and an examination of the ship's papers and other documents that were found on the captured vessel, which might comprise an extremely disorganized and heterogeneous body of loose sheets of paper, notebooks, captain's logs, sealed envelopes, tiny slips of paper containing prayers to the Virgen del Carmen, and all sorts of stuff was gathered off these ships. And the writers of the more than 160,000 personal letters that are in the National Archives prize papers collection used, something on the order of 20 different languages at least to express their thoughts, ranging from Yiddish to Arabic. So clearly translators were needed if this material was going to be employed to determine the nationality, the national character of the ship and its cargo. And this is where notaries and interpreters entered the story. In the UK in the 18th century, notaries were the only people empowered to produce legally authorized translations of these sorts of papers. They were, or maybe I put this on a slide, they were persons whose office it is publicly to attest deeds or writings, and especially to certify their authenticity for use in other countries and in other languages. And the British High Court of Admiralty, for that reason, had an address book of notaries whom they relied on to carry out this absolutely essential work to determining the legitimacy of the capture of a particular ship. I've identified several dozen or so who were based in London, who worked regularly for the Admiralty between about 1760 and 1820 or so. These translators were expected to do much more than simply translate documents that they'd had handed over to them. They were supposed to identify the relevant documents to translate. So they might be handed a huge tranche of papers and told to pick out the bits that were relevant to the question of the nationality of the ship. They were also expected to highlight any information of irregular practice, such as smuggling, etc., which would also weaken the claim of the ship's owners to get their ship back. So their role, in other words, wasn't simply to translate, but also to interpret. And they might also be employed by the captains of captured ships or of the captors to bolster their own claims. So they might work simultaneously for the Admiralty and also for several of the litigants producing translations for them, or for merchants associated with the cargoes who wanted to put in a claim, etc. So then notaries needed to be certified as a notary. Court, and I'll say a little bit more about that perhaps later on. Court interpreters to provide simultaneous translation in court. needed no formal qualifications, but they were expected to be conversant in and well acquainted with the language in question. That was the standard phrase that was used with court interpreters. And any interpretation needed to be signed off by a notary as well, unless the interpreter happened to be a notary, like Jacob de Pinna. So notaries, in other words, underpinned the entire system of naval prize. That is the point that I'm trying to make. They were part of the administrative system that, as John Brewer argued some time ago, created the fiscal military state. They were part of that administrative structure. And Jacob de Pinna was one of the British High Court of Admiralty's favorite translators. They turned to him time and again. So I have no idea what Jacob de Pinna looked like, but he was born in Amsterdam, and here we have a sober-looking Dutch notary. Imagine that might be Jacob de Pinna. And so they turned to him time and again, particularly for complex cases involving multiple languages. In the case of the two ships, the Santiago Apostol and the Général Dumouriez, that got me interested in Jacob de Pinna in the first place, he translated from Spanish, but this was only the beginning of his linguistic capacity. In 1825, 1826, to give you another example, he and his son, who also went into the notarial business, translated hundreds of pages of multilingual documents captured from the Muni, a ship that was sailing from Livorno with a cargo of textiles and other things. And as de Pinna noted in his invoice, these documents employed 3 different scripts, which he described as Arabic, Latin, Al-Quranic, as he called it, or Arabic, and Hebrew. And they were in Turkish, Italian, and several versions of Arabic. So one of the documents from the Muni, for example, he described in his invoice as translated, quote, from the Algerian dialect of the Arabic language written in Hebrew characters. His bill for this monumental task was a substantial £125. So overall, from what I've seen, de Pinna translated from Spanish, he translated from French, he translated from Italian, he translated from Portuguese, translated from Dutch, from German, from Judeo-Arabic, that's the Algerian dialect in question, and from Hebrew. And here we have some examples of his signature and his seal for things he'd signed off on. And he could also do you a translation in Turkish or in Greek. He didn't do them himself, but he knew a man who could. So while other London translators could maybe offer, Italian and French and Dutch, or specialized in Danish and Dutch, de Pinna could tackle most of the languages that were employed in the Mediterranean's highly international commerce. And he could also handle the languages of Western European colonial trade as well. So you can see the appeal that he held for the Admiralty. And de Pinna's impressive linguistic skills reflect his own history. He and his family had Portuguese ancestry and had come to the UK via the Netherlands. That's where de Pinna was born. And Jacob de Pinna and his sometimes partners, here are some of examples of some material sent to Jacob de Pinna for translation, just to give you a sense of the sorts of things he was working with. He and his partners were Sephardic Jews. They were members of the small community of Sephardim who had been living in London since the mid-17th century. And for part of his adult life, de Pinna resided in Bethnal Green, an area that was long associated with Sephardic Jews. And towards the end of the 18th century, wealthier Jews began to move out of Bethnal Green, and de Pinna did the same. By 1809, he had moved into a house in Leadenhall Street in the city near his place of work, which was initially in Cornhill. And his Admiralty work alone was bringing in some £300 a year. And despite several brushes with unpaid debts, his business prospered sufficiently for him to add a clause to his house contents insurance to cover his collection of porcelain. And he also began to describe himself as a gentleman. And so maybe, do I have another, yeah, here we can go back. So there's Cortisos, his partner. Both professionally and socially, de Pinna was embedded in London's Sephardic community. He provided legal services to other Jews, and he attended the Beresmark Synagogue, the oldest Sephardic synagogue in London, also located in the city near de Pinna's place of work and his residence. In 1767, he became a Freemason, as did many other Jews in 18th century London. In 1781, he married a cousin, Luna Sarfati. It's impossible for me to say whether they kept a kosher household. Many London Jews did not. The couple had 9 children. One son became a talented and very successful composer of parlor music. There you can see Joseph de Pinna. Another continued into the notarial business with his father, Jacob de Pinna, and de Pinna Notaries still offers notarial services. And I believe that members both of the de Pinna firm and also possibly the de Pinna family are somewhere in the room at present. I can see a few here. So to turn to the first of my 2 questions that I posed at the start of the presentation, is there any evidence to support the view that Jacob de Pinna functioned as a culture broker, operating between British naval bureaucracy and the foreign crews of the captured vessels carried into the UK? So let's think about that to begin with. Well, in the interest of time, I'm not going to review the scholarship either on early modern culture brokers, or any other type of culture broker, other than to try to say that this rich scholarship, and maybe I'll give you some illustrations. I mean, here are some examples of the kind of rich body of scholarship on the early modern culture broker that exists. I mean, I'm going to say that this scholarship on early modern translators and go-betweens and other intermediaries stresses their absolute ubiquity and centrality to early modern globalization, as well as to literary and scientific culture during this period. And from the Aztec interpreter La Malinche, who provided strategic advice to the Spanish conquistador Hernán Cortés, to the Jesuits who were translating Confucian writings into Latin, translators were absolutely everywhere in this expanding world. Multilingual factors and interpreters and agents located in many parts of the world were essential to Europe's commercial and colonial expansion, as either willingly or unwillingly, they brokered encounters of all sorts, translating, arranging commercial deals on all sorts of things. And the early modern era also saw an increase in diplomatic missions between geographically and linguistically distant polities, and a consequently growing need for interpreters who could handle an expanded range of languages. And while this was going on at the same time, written translations of religious and philosophical and scientific and literary texts speeded the dissemination of ideas, introduced new genres and practices, and helped create a distinct international community of savants during this period. So translators from the Ottoman dragomans to aristocratic literati translating Plutarch, they're now recognized as crucial figures in the political, cultural, and economic changes that were underway in this period because of their capacity to act as go-betweens and culture brokers. None of this rich scholarship, however, has anything, as far as I can see, to say about men like Jacob de Pinna, who sat at a desk in the City of London translating bills of lading. So there's a big scholarship saying these people are really important, but it doesn't really look at people like Jacob de Pinna. If we turn to the contemporary social science research into interpreters today, this stresses that interpreters, simultaneous interpreters in particular, always invariably undertake complex emotional and intercultural work, even again, if that's not the purpose for which they're employed. And it's particularly the case with court interpreters, who often need to convey painful or sensitive information. So there's a body of scholarship there which says this is a kind of form of emotional work that's being done. And there's also a small but sophisticated body of research into early modern notaries, which stresses the notary's role in the emergent state and in facilitating increasingly complex interpersonal commercial interactions. Although often the scholarship doesn't look at the notary's role as a translator particularly. And I've tried to draw on all of these different bodies of scholarship in thinking about Jacob de Pinna and his interactions with foreign crews. So as I said before, the more I read about this and the scholarship and the more I thought about Jacob de Pinna, the more curious I became about his relationship with these Spanish mariners who stuck for years either on their ship in Portsmouth Harbor or on the Isle of Wight. It was clear that many of these sailors found their situation opaque, if not downright bewildering. Nicolas Roulet, who was a 30-year-old mariner from the French ship, the Général du Warwick, for instance, was taken to London from Stapleton Prison near Bristol, where he was being held as an enemy. He was taken for a court appearance to London, and during the interrogation, he was asked through an interpreter who had brought him to London. And he said he had no idea, as this said person could not speak French. So confusion about the most basic aspects of their circumstances seems to have been a common state for captured mariners. Now, to be sure, some of the French and Spanish crew might have known English, just as some British mariners spoke other languages, but there is no evidence of this in the substantial documentation that this particular case generated. Manuel Calvo, who was the captain of the Spanish ship, told the Spanish consul shortly after his capture that since he spoke no English, the British were relying entirely on interpreters for all communication with him. And none of the sailors or officers who were questioned over a several-year period deposed in English. The Santiago's captain, for example, continued to require an interpreter throughout the 2 years of residence that he spent in the UK. So ships certainly could be cosmopolitan spaces, but that doesn't mean that all sailors were multilingual. Another little example of snippet onto this is when captured French or Spanish mariners wrote to the Admiralty's wonderfully named Sick and Hurt Board, pleading for better treatment, they penned their appeals in the vast majority in their native language. And indeed, any who wrote in English to the Admiralty asking for this or that were likely to be snapped up immediately as interpreters to work with the crew. So what role then did translators such as de Pinna play in their experience of the British legal system? Well, his interactions with the sailors on the two ships that I was particularly interested in took place both inside and outside of the courtroom. For the crew of well, actually not just of those ships, but all the ships that he was involved in, for the crew of the Purificación de Nuestra Señora, he drew up a letter recounting their version of what had happened when their ship was seized off Cap de San Antoni and carried into Ramsgate. So, maybe I've got a little slide. There we are, that's from the Pinna Archives. Thank you, the Pinna Archives, for that. And to do this, he obviously spoke to these sailors and listened to their story of the rather eventful capture of their ship and what had happened, and then translated, put it down in English for them. In the case of the Santiago Apostol, in addition to interpreting while men were deposing in court, he translated British newspapers for them, and he spoke to them regularly about the business, as it was called, of the court. And we know this from his invoices, and also from an unusual commendation that the captain of the Spanish vessel wrote shortly before he, the captain, returned to Spain in 1795, in which he wrote a sort of letter of appreciation of Jacob de Pinna, expressing his gratitude for the fact that de Pinna had helped him and his crew, as he put it, better understand in our language what was happening with the protracted court case. So through these interactions with these captured sailors, de Pinna and other translators became go-betweens, helping these men make sense of the situation in which they unwillingly found themselves. And again, that was not the purpose for which they were employed, but that was part of their experience of work. And this sort of work, as I mentioned a moment ago, is, as the research and scholars who work on translation studies stress, it's a form of emotional labor. In Britain's High Court of Admiralty, it was the judges who made decisions that, that a ship would not be returned, that sailors would go home empty-handed, that they would lose their small business affairs in the cargo, etc. But it was Admiralty translators who conveyed this information in a language that the sailors could understand. They were the ones who delivered the bad news. So did Pinna employ the sort of circumlocutions that scholars identify in contemporary court interpreters, where they break out of the first person and they start to put in distancing clauses by saying, as the judge speaks, they say that? Did he do that? Well, that we don't know. But when they did not, interpreters became to some degree responsible for the words that they conveyed. And it was, to take another case, it was a Falmouth interpreter who told the captured French pilot Juan Arizmendi to sit down and be quiet and say no more when Arizmendi questioned some aspects of the way that he was being interrogated. The interpreter was translating the words of the interrogating officials, but Arizmendi blamed him. Arizmendi blamed the interpreter as much as the examining commissioners for, as he put it in his complaint, speaking in a very threatening manner, which greatly intimidated him. So it was the interpreter who got, took the blame in a way for the treatment of Arizmendi in this case. So the labor that Admiralty translators undertook, in other words, wasn't simply bureaucratic, but at times it was personal and emotional. Right. And so intermediaries, in other words, can appear in all sorts of guises. And translation can occur in many different settings. So not all the documents translated in Europe were literary texts, nor did all oral interpreting take place in colonial contact zones or in port cities or diplomatic gatherings. Translators also oiled the wheels of global trade while sitting at desks in the City of London, and they intervened in the era's many global wars by standing in court to translate the testimonies of mariners and merchants caught up in these conflicts. And as I've been suggesting, when they carried out these tasks, men such as Jacob de Pinna at times also served as culture brokers, helping people cast adrift by Europe's global warfare to make sense of the unexpected circumstances in which they found themselves. So they played, I think, Admiralty translators played a consequential, but today almost invisible role in Europe's 18th century global expansion. So let me now turn to, oh yes, why did I do that again? Who knows? To the second part of what I want to talk about. I want to think about whether we can reconstruct any of Jacob de Pinna's working life or mental world. As I said before, to my knowledge, he left no diaries. I've not located any personal letters. What we have are the many pages of translated materials that he transcribed in his neat and distinctive hand. We have the bills for the work that he did, and we have the documents that he translated as well, as I said. There are also a few comments about him by others, such as the comment from the Spanish captain that I cited a moment ago. So to make sense of these materials, I've tried to draw on methodologies from the sociology of work. And the sociology of work is an approach that was pioneered by the US sociologist Everett Hughes in the mid-20th century. And it focuses on the common variables that shape most forms of work in the past and the present, such as the skills and tools that the work requires, or the degree of control that a practitioner might have over the pace of work, or the physical demands that the work imposes on the laborer. And so it looks at questions that you could ask of many different sorts of work. And in trying to seek commonalities across experiences of work, whether those are trainee doctors or New York City doormen, to look at the sorts of examples that the sociology of work has considered. It offers a range of analytical tools that I found quite interesting. And the approach, for instance, provides some insights into the particular challenges faced by professions such as translator. Not that Hughes himself ever considered translators, but professions which translation is an example of, that involve a degree of specialization or specialist knowledge that's not available to the general public. And translation, if you think about it, is a quite delicate type of work. It involves converting words from one language into a language that we can understand. If we could understand the original language, we wouldn't need a translator, right? So how do we know that the translator is doing a good job? And this need to trust, here I'm quoting from the historian Sarah Schneewind, who's written some very nice stuff about using this methodology in historical context. She writes, the need to trust, coupled with the inability to verify, cause a complex swirl of feelings around hiring a specialist. So that may relate to experiences we've had, or is this person any good? So in the case of Jacob de Pinna, we can glimpse the anxieties caused by this need to trust, coupled with the inability to verify. What if, for example, the notary undertaking the translation were someone one might not want to trust? What, for instance, if they were a Jew? So casual anti-Semitism permeated deeply into Georgian society, where enduring religious hostility combined with a broad secular distrust of Jews as conniving and dishonest. In British popular imagination, Jews were sort of inherently untrustworthy. I mean, that's sort of the common image. So how might this affect the ability of a Jewish notary to establish social trust, in particular confidence that they were doing a good job in their translations? We can get some sense of this from some comments made in 1793 by Admiralty Judge Sir James Marriott, who complained, quite rightly, about a mountain of confiscated French personal documents that was building up in the Admiralty offices and Doctors' Commons. He observed that vast quantities of these letters that were taken from captured ships, which he thought doubtless contained valuable intelligence information about the French enemy that could be used to inform British naval policy. And the problem was, he said, that these were being captured in such numbers that they totally overwhelmed the ability of the Admiralty to process them, even assuming that Admiralty clerks were, as he put it, acquainted with the French language and character of handwriting to read them, which they weren't. He pointed out. So this valuable information was lying around unread and unanalyzed in Doctors' Commons. Even worse, in Marriott's point of view, these personal missives were being read by the wrong people. And specifically, he complained they were being rifled through, or maybe I'll put this on a little quote. Here we are. They were being rifled through by a certain Jew notary, as he put it, one de Pinna, who was employed, contrary as he saw to all proper decency, to look through these papers on behalf of clients and the Admiralty. He thought this was highly inappropriate, and whoever should be allowed to read them should be a person of extreme good character, infinitely superior to common notaries and Jews, as he put it. And here is a picture of, a caricature of a so-called Jew broker, which, perhaps was the kind of figure that de Pinna evoked in James Marriott's mind. Now, Jacob de Pinna was a member of the Worshipful Company of Scriveners, and he absolutely, in fact, let's see, here we have his faculty to practice. This is, again, thanks to the de Pinna Notary Archives. There's his faculty to practice confirmed by the Archbishop of Canterbury. He absolutely possessed the legal license to undertake notarized translations. The fact that he was a licensed London notary meant that, as the documents of the time put it, entire faith and credit is and ought to be given in court, was the standard phrase, to any document he authenticated. And the Admiralty was quite explicit about this. On page joined the livery company in 1775. He had more than 20 years' experience working for the Admiralty at the time that James Marriott questioned his credentials. So from this perspective, he was without doubt a confidential person in His Majesty's government, exactly the sort of person that Marriott thought should have access to these papers. So what Marriott's attack on de Pinna reveals is clearly his distrust of Jews, but I think we can say a little bit more than that. I think what it reveals also is that in his view, the entire profession of notaries, de Pinna included, lacked what sociologists of work would call license. That doesn't refer to your legal license to practice. It refers to the social trust which is necessary for these kinds of professions that involve a degree of specialization not available to the general public. So the sociology of work draws our attention to the discomfort caused by this need to trust combined with the inability to verify in a way that puts notaries in a particularly delicate position where they need not simply their faculty to practice, but they need to have social trust from the society more generally. And I think we can see this. So certainly his Marriott's outburst reflects his attitude towards Jews, but I think it also says something about the role of the translator in these circumstances. I think they also reflect another theme also highlighted by the sociology of work, which is what theorists call guilty knowledge. This refers to sensitive information about other people, as well as perhaps familiarity with illicit practices gained through one's profession. So, for example, a theologian might be familiar with dangerous heresies, or a doctor, or a priest, or indeed, for that matter, a notary might have special access to personal, intimate information about their clients. So clients need to trust such practitioners not to reveal their sensitive information to all and sundry. This is why, for instance, the interpreter Mr. Martins placed an advertisement in the 1780 Leeds Intelligencer, assuring merchants that they could rely on, quote, his most scrupulous secrecy when he translated business letters on their behalf. Notaries certainly use distinctive signatures and seals to certify that a translation was accurate, but that didn't in itself assure anybody of the notary's discretion. So that, as with the concept of license that I was talking about before, that also required social trust. And so Marriott's complaints that de Pinna was improperly gaining access to sensitive information contained in these captured French personal letters reflects also, I think, the discomfort that this so-called guilty or privileged knowledge can cause, as well as also the need for social alongside legal recognition of one's right to practice. Interpreters and go-betweens were always at risk of having their competence, their discretion, and their good faith questioned by litigants. And that, I think, in part explains the assistance in every notarial certification that the translation was faithfully executed and the, form of words that surrounds the certification. It also, I think, explains the elaborate religious preambles that some notarized documents, particularly from the north of Europe, the Britain's North American colonies often had, which would often begin with long in the name of God, et cetera, before the translation. I think that's why we get those. Let's see if I have went back to that again. We don't know that. Yeah, there's an example of this sort of certification itself. It's been basically translated. Well, can we recover anything more of the lived experience of Admiralty translators such as Jacob de Pinna? Again, the sociology of work provides a sort of set of tools that I think we can use through its focus on the daily rhythms and activities that shape a practitioner's working life. What skills were requisite? What sort of equipment? The notebooks aimed, or the handbooks, the handbooks aimed at notaries highlight some of the skills that a notary ought to possess, since they were expected to draw commercial contracts. They should have a good head for figures. They should have a talent for languages. They should master the intricacies of complex financial instruments such as bills of exchange, which, as Francesca Tribolato has shown, were poorly understood at the time, as I think they are today. But mental tools were not the only equipment that a translator needed. Carrying out notarial desk work also required ink, paper, dictionaries, desks for that matter. The Admiralty translator, Robert Slade, got through 650 sheets of paper in 3 months in 1785. And in the same period, he and his partner got through 100 pens, a lot of red ink, wax, ribbons, etc. De Pinna's one-time partner, Joseph Cortizos, left his dictionaries to his wife, but he recommended that she give them to their sons in the event that they take up my business. Another Anglo-Jewish notary, Bernard von Sandow, owned, quote, 50 or 60 books as dictionaries and others, chiefly requisite for my profession. De Pinna, a contemporary of these men, would have owned a similar number of necessary volumes. And again, he took the trouble to insure his books in his house contents insurance policy with the Sun Fire office. Sandow's office further contained several desks, shelving to house his dictionaries, and a counting house desk, another specialized piece of equipment. This was a desk with long legs, which were longer in the back than in the front, that enabled the person working at them to maintain a merely standing position, a bit like a working desk today. So sociologists of work are interested in the ways in which practitioners interact with their equipment, and also the degree of control that they have over the pace in which they're expected to work. So one of De Pinna's bills was for translating some documents into Spanish with the utmost expedition. So what were the physical implications of perching for long hours at a high desk, translating reports from English into Spanish at top speed? Proper posture for handwriting was a topic of increasing interest during this period, because it was thought to communicate a disciplined and professional identity. Slumping over your desk, in contrast, betokened carelessness or laziness. And even if no one witnessed this unprofessional behavior, it might induce scrivener's palsy, a painful inflammation of the wrist. Well, when not sitting erect at desks, notaries traveled back and forth between their offices, the court, and their clients. They billed for attending in the registry and inspecting the ship's papers in order to know what was necessary to be translated. They consulted with captors and captured crews. In the case of the French and Spanish ships that I was interested in, one invoice itemized the money due the translator, quote, for his constant attendance upon the crew during this business. Notaries needed to keep track of the mountains of paperwork that they processed. The Admiralty ticked off when documents were given out to them, and they ticked them off when they were brought back. And you needed to make sure you didn't mix these papers up, as the notary Caspar Schomberg did when he inadvertently returned to the Admiralty, along with a tranche of papers that he translated for them, a personal invitation to his Masonic lodge that had somehow got mixed in with the paperwork, and preventing this sort of mistake demanded, as notarial guidebooks put it, an unwearied application to business, no matter how wearisome the task at hand might actually be. So they needed to remain alert, despite the tedium of perhaps translating endless bills of lading, or as one of De Pinna's invoices put it, perusing upwards of 400 irrelevant letters. But the bill for which was a really unsatisfying £2.13 and 4 pence. So these sorts of details, I think, help paint a picture of the nature of the workmen such as De Pinna undertook, and they convey some sense of daily life. Let's see, I think I have a little, so yeah, there's a picture of maybe an office. We can think about office, but can we, and here I'm coming towards the very end, can we recover any of Jacob De Pinna's mental world from these sources? There's a very nice study by the historian Mary Lindemann called A Dutch Notary and His Clients. in which she suggests that what she calls uncooperative records, such as invoices, can constitute a form of life writing. And she uses them to try to reconstruct the life of Matthias Martin, an unexceptional 17th century Amsterdam notary who left an unusually voluminous collection of notarial papers in the Dutch archives. And she concluded that as notaries built up relationships with their long-term clients, so the notaries world came to embrace, at least in the imagination, the spaces through which their clients moved. The distant destinations of the cargoes that they recorded, she argued, must have taken on a certain familiarity. So as de Pinna was translating the bills of lading for the Purificación de Nuestra Señora, the other case that I mentioned earlier, did he travel in his mind's eye to Montevideo in South America, the ship's destination? Did its cargo of goods with its 10 dozen gold and silver embroidered sandals, one bassoon, one timbrel, and various pieces of music, the 77 middling sized hats, the artificial flowers, the silk stockings, do they paint a picture in his imagination of this unknown city and its inhabitants? Was he impressed, as I was, by this is not a process, this is my fabulous photography skills, this is a very large piece of paper, by the absolutely magnificent tugra, that's the calligraphy at the top of that document, of the Ottoman Sultan, Selim III, which is written in glistening gold and black ink on a piece of milky white paper, which was mixed in, it's a sort of passport for the ship, mixed in amongst the mundane records of a shipment of wheat from 1807. You know, when he unfolded this, did this luxurious document shape his imagination of distant Constantinople and its wealth? Jacob de Pinna spoke with sailors from France, from Spain, from Holland, and much farther afield, listening to their stories of naval battles and capture at sea. Lindemann suggests that the routine recording of other people's experiences, perceptions, desires, ambitions, successes, failures, and frustrations in legal documents invariably shaped a notary's sense of self. So what sort of self, then, might Jacob de Pinna have developed as a result of his involvement with the British Admiralty, which was surely his longest term and most remunerative professional relationship? The fact that by 1809 he had begun to call himself a gentleman suggests that he saw himself as a respectable member of London's professional world, and a great ambition. His association with the Admiralty bolstered his genteel status, and he on occasion spelled this out explicitly, stating that he was not merely a notary public, but that he was, quote, appointed translator to the registry of His Britannic Majesty's High Court of Admiralty in England. Also, to try to conclude, Jacob de Pinna worked during a period of intense naval conflict that pitted British ships against vessels from many parts of the globe. The crew of the Spanish Santiago Apostol that I mentioned earlier, they had sailors from Campeche, from Guayaquil, from Manila, as well as from many parts of Spain. These were the men who, as the ship's captain Manuel Calvo put it, de Pinna had helped better understand in our language the circumstances in which they found themselves marooned for years on end on the Isle of Wight. So his work, I've suggested, as an interpreter, made him a sort of go-between, whose words mediated between these men and the machinery of the British Admiralty. Global commerce and global warfare in the late 18th century shaped the experiences of many people in Britain, including notaries. From his office in the city, de Pinna worked at the heart of one of the institutions, the Royal Navy, that was itself central to Britain's dominance in both. His involvement was simultaneously bureaucratic and interpersonal. As he sifted through the inventories for cargoes laden onto ships in Veracruz, Barcelona, and Cochin, he formed part of the global network that brought indigo and sandalwood into Britain alongside silver watches, long veils of embroidered silk, vast quantities of sugar, and much more. These disparate and consequential or exotic objects were part of de Pinna's mental world. So too were the stories of the men who traveled with them. Paying attention to notary scriveners highlights the invisible work of these London translators who made possible the entire system of naval prize, a source of immense wealth to Britain during this period. Who cares about the notary and the records he left, whether in Manila, Quito, Albany, Genoa, or Nantes? The historian Catherine Burns asked in 2005. Burns offered several reasons to be interested in these ubiquitous but historically marginal figures, including the notary's ability to produce a particular kind of truth. Burns proposed that we should view the notarized document as a space where negotiations took place. She suggests that these bland documents may be the material traces of discussions between real people in the past. The records left by Jacob de Pinna, certifying that he had faithfully translated a witness's words, reflect de Pinna's role as an intermediary between the British Admiralty and these individual sailors and officers caught in the wake of the 18th century's global conflicts. And in attempting to excavate his world, I hope we can better appreciate the role of such men as small but consequential figures in Europe's 18th century global expansion. Thank you very much for listening.